Smooth transitions and speed ramps. Can we talk about how to do it better? That video was something I worked on a couple weeks back. If you want to see more of my professional work, you can follow my business Instagram. Or if you want to see the personal things that I'm up to, you can follow that Instagram as well. And if you're learning a lot from these videos, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date when I post more. Okay, so I didn't call this video transition mistakes or speed ramp mistakes or something negative like that. I really wanted to open up a discussion about how and why we should be implementing these types of transitions into our video work. After this rant, I'll show you how I was able to achieve these transitions all in camera. So before I give you my opinions, comment below about some of your favorite videos or films that use these transitions effectively. As with anything today, it always comes back to finding ways to better tell your story. I think transitions and speed ramps can be used, but should be ways to stretch and compress time in telling your story rather than just being flashy. Now, you could very well use these techniques to articulate something or add a little bit of an inflection to things, and that's okay. However, before reaching for all of these tricks, I would urge you to look at other cinematic and storytelling tools that you can use to your advantage. Things like lighting, composition, narrative, there's so many more things that you can pull from to tell a good story that you don't always need to sprinkle every little thing with a bunch of transitions. And that's especially true in marketing and advertising because you really need to be thinking about the audience that's going to be watching this video. Small business, corporate video, client testimonials, I don't know if these effects or transitions are appropriate for those style of videos unless it suits the audience that you're trying to appeal to. In my mini video, when it's coming around the corner and then it slows down, that served a purpose to me. I wanted to hit pause on the action that was happening, and then it ramps up and does a transition into a close-up of the tire, and then we kind of savor that moment again until it whips out into the next shot. And even that rotation transition served a purpose. The tire was spinning, and then it quickly whipped into the next shot, and I wanted the camera to go along in that journey with the car. I think so many people throw in these random transitions without really thinking about the purpose behind them. Another repeat offender is the zoom transition. Let's take the window shot for this analysis. The arbitrary story we have set up here is the car starting in the garage and then going for a drive. And with every drive, there's always a destination. For this, it was heading to a dock by the lake. Now, if you remember in the beginning, some of the setup goes into the interior, and I really wanted to come full circle to close out the video and also highlight a quick second of the interior. So I have a camera on a gimbal doing a dolly style move where it moves in and out through the window. And I also had another shot where I move in and out of focus on the mini logo. So both of these shots were doing a very similar movement. When I decided to transition in between them, it was a very organic zoom transition because the camera was already doing the zooming. All I had to do was a simple crossfade. And that brings me to my last big old nope that I see all the time, and that's mismatched directions. If you have a shot that's moving from left to right and then you whip pan, you mask, you wipe, you do some type of transition, the following shot better also be moving left to right. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. The only time I could see mismatched camera movements working together is if the subject is still moving in the same direction. because otherwise you don't really have any continuity and your eye doesn't have anything to lock onto if you're going from one direction and jerking back to another. And it's not just with side-to-side movements. I've even seen mismatched zooms. Like if your transition zooms in, the following shot needs to zoom in with it. You need to carry the viewer along with you. You need to take them along for the ride. And this is how you really get the smooth transitions. Okay, so now let's head over to the computer and I'll show you how I edit all of this within Davinci Resolve. We made it into Resolve. I love when I stress the importance of story over flashy effects, and then I do the complete opposite with that keyboard sequence. But it looked cool, and it kind of had a story to it. We're moving from the talking portion into the computer portion, so... Okay, this video only has about 7 or 8 transitions, depending on how you slice it, and then there's a little bit of speed ramping to complement some of those transitions. And this is the first one that I want to look at. So let's open up the time-remapping properties. You can select the clips and hit Control-R, or you can right-click and select Retime Controls. And we're also going to open up the Retime curve for these clips. And this is just going to give us a graph view of how we're altering the speed. And by default, it's going to show you the retime frame. And what you want to do is change that to retime speed by just unchecking that and making sure that everything else is turned off as well, just so you're only seeing the retime speed. So we'll do the same thing down here. And this shot starts at around 1000%, right at 971%. And then it ramps down into 40% speed because this was shot in 4K 60 on the Pocket 4K. And the easiest way to create new points and retime is to just Alt-click on wherever you want things to change, and then you can click and drag in the in-between and it'll adjust the time. Alternatively, you can have your playhead set to where you want the point to be, hit this drop down arrow and click add speed point. So that's how I'm making these alterations. And if you're trying to do something like this yourself, you might get stuck at 300% speed when you're retiming this because there's that vertical limit on how high you can drag this line. And the easiest way to fix that is to go up to where the percentage is on either side and you can actually drag this. And this changes the maximum view in percentage of how fast you can ramp things. This is not actually changing the value, it's just changing the scale of the graph. And then a final way you can actually change the speed to even faster is if you click on the corner here and drag this in, that will adjust the speed. If you drag it with this icon, that's adjusting the speed. If you drag it with this one, that's actually adjusting the in and out point of the clip. So moving on to the transition portion, as I mentioned earlier, all of these were really in camera, and the only thing I did was time remap and do simple crossfades. So if we bring up our opacity onto this curve, you'll see that it goes from 100 down to 0 in about 5 frames. So if we nudge that frame by frame, you can clearly see it's just a simple crossfade. Doesn't really look that good whenever you're watching it at this speed, but when you see it all together, it just feels like the camera is moving into the wheel. And then to get this next shot to organically feel like it connects with the previous, you want to start with it being ramped up again, because in the previous we are ramping up. And again, we're starting close to 1000%. We're at 845 in this example, back down to 40%. And let's look at the raw clip just so you guys can see how I achieved this shot. I actually had the Pocket 4K on the Ronin S in the 360 roll mode, and the car was sitting completely still. This was shot later at the lake, super close up of just that, and I spun the gimbal around in the roll mode. And as you can see, this took me a couple tries and a couple different clips because I tried to get the axis in which the gimbal was rotating to match with the wheel, so it didn't kind of bounce around while it's rotating. It just kind of stays as if it were driving on the ground. And then whenever you ramp this, it looks like the camera's locked to the wheel and we're shooting in some super high frame rate, but it was really just all achieved with some time remapping and a stationary shot. And in this next one, the same principles are going to apply, so let's open up that retime curve. Again, we're going to switch this to retime speed and make sure everything else is checked off. And we start with a ramp up, ramp down, so it matches with the previous ramp up. And if we bring up the opacity on this one, there's a couple frame crossfade. And the way that this is looking organic, if we pull this raw clip up, this was shot in the same way on a gimbal in the 360 roll mode, and all I did was just push in and out on the gimbal. And then when we ramp this up, it matches the direction that the wheel was spinning previously, so it makes everything blend together really nicely. And as you see throughout the rest of the edit, this technique is what keeps things looking so smooth. And then one of the final transitions is pushing in and out of this window. This one was shot in reverse, so we started inside the car and then moved backwards, and then I had Zane roll up the window as my camera was coming out. This again took multiple tries. I think this one took the most out of all of them because I really wanted the window to come up right in front of the lens. So this one is the one I ended up going with because it looks the best. It takes up the whole frame and makes it a little bit more immersive for the viewer. And then I have this other clip where I move in and out of focus with the mini logo. And this shot in itself is pretty basic, but it has that same camera movement from the previous shot. So by bouncing in and out of this shot, I was able to move to this one pretty cleanly. And typically when you see a shot reverse, you're expecting just to see the same thing happen in reverse. So as we pull out, you're expecting just to see the end again, but it actually just crossfades. And by the time you realize it, you're already into this shot. And that's kind of why I thought these shots looked really cool together. The last little secret sauce that I'm going to give you guys is actually on the topic of motion blur. This is the most overlooked thing I see whenever I'm seeing other people's speed ramps in their video work. There's no motion blur. And it makes sense when you're shooting. You're not going to slow down your shutter speed for the entire shot if you're only going to be ramping one portion. So it makes sense to keep the shutter speed with the 180-degree rule of what you're filming in. But then when you speed it up, there's going to be choppy motion and lack of natural motion blur. Now, traditionally, when I'm editing in Premiere, the only real way to simulate this would be to keyframe some different types of blurs, whether that's directional blur or radial blur for zooming, but I think that's only available in After Effects anyway. And that's what I would do. I would send my clips to an After Effects composition, and I wouldn't manually keyframe those type of effects. There's actually plugins built into After Effects that will simulate motion blur for you. There's pixel motion, and there's CC force motion blur. There's, CC wide time. A couple different ones will do similar things, but if you're trying to have a quick turnaround time for a video project, it might just seem easiest to skip this step altogether. Luckily, in Resolve, there is a plugin built in that will do this for you in the color tab. If you go down to the color tab and then you head over to the motion effects area, this is where you're going to find your different types of noise reduction, but you'll also find motion blur. So let me illustrate what this does. If you look at this wheel, it's turning and it's in the middle of one of those sped up portions, and you can see visibly here, you have motion blur on the wheel. If I were to take this motion blur back down to 0, the wheel becomes completely sharp again because there wasn't any motion blur present in the shot because we shot this sitting still. As expected, if you ramp this up, it's just gonna be choppy, it's not gonna look natural. So by having this, you can just crank that up to 100 pretty much, and now it's blurring how it would if it were actually driving. I plan to dedicate an entire video to some advanced speed ramping techniques like we briefly touched on here, and it's gonna cover things like that marriage between Premiere and After Effects and how to stay working quickly while bouncing between programs. And I'll also be showing you how to implement those techniques into Davinci Resolve as well. So no matter what platform you're editing on, you're still gonna be able to implement these techniques. Again, I want to hear your thoughts on these smooth transitions and these speed ramps. Are they just gimmicky? Do they have their place? What do you think? I obviously gave my opinion, so I'd love to hear your feedback and see what you guys are thinking on this topic. And lastly, if you have any comments, any requests for future video topics, leave those in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.